Kharg Island, it's a pretty small piece of land. My understanding is that it's about the third of the size of Manhattan. So this is a very sort of dangerous game, trying to sort of simultaneously affect military and non-oil targets while at the same time issuing this threat, as you were just describing, saying, if Iran does not allow transit through Hormuz for other ships, that the oil export infrastructure would also be hit there. So yes, this is Kharg Island handles approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports. And let's remember that right now, basically Iranian oil is more or less some of the only oil that's making it through the Strait of Hormuz right now. Although, your outlet had some really interesting reporting overnight about how some liquefied petroleum gas was able to make it through en route to India based on some negotiation between Iran and India. But yes, I think President Trump is sort of doing something or attempting to do something that's a pretty volatile and dangerous game here, which is to sort of get things flowing a little bit or at least more through the strait, while at the same time issuing a threat that, if carried out, would in fact restrict the only amounts of oil that are already sort of getting through. So I'm very curious to see what happens when markets open again on Sunday night.
Dan Williams, I want to go to you because I want to ask you about this Netanyahu quote that you have in your most recent article. The Israeli prime minister, who was very in favor of an operation like this and has been for decades and tried to get this to happen during the first Trump administration, said something that I found rather surprising, and I'd like your take on it, about regime change in Iran, saying we are creating the optimal conditions for toppling of the regime. But again, I do not deny that I can't tell you with certainty the Iranian people will bring down the regime. A regime is ultimately brought down from within. Is that likely to happen? And if it doesn't, what was the point of this operation?
Well, I think that's not inconsistent given what we heard from the outset, both from the Israeli prime minister and the US president. You'll remember that in the opening statements on February 28th, when this war began, in fact, Trump had the punchiest line. He said the Iranian people, the Iranian opposition, should shelter indoors while the bombs drop, the implication being the time would come for them to come out and take the reins of power. So basically, the Israeli prime minister in those public remarks was circling back to that original idea, saying that now help that had been promised had now arrived in Iran. He specifically talked about tactical airstrikes being conducted against Basij and IRGC emplacements in the streets and checkpoints of Tehran. These are all meant, he said, to embolden the opposition to come out. However, he said he can't guarantee it would happen. Obviously, that would be up to the Iranian people, the opposition, who would face enormous risk still in doing so, despite having seen the state's capabilities drastically reduced by this war. I see no inconsistency there. What was new here was the signaling. The prime minister saying effectively, you waited for the moment has now arrived. It would appear the allies are pressing this advantage as they see it to as far as they can in the coming days to wither the strength of that state as much as possible, including by applying pressure on energy, in the hope that there will be some kind of action on the ground, on organic uprising. One imagines on the clandestine level, there's also work being done behind the scenes to encourage that.
The latest there from the Prime Minister of Israel. We look to what the President of the United States has said in recent days about the goals and efficacy of these attacks so far. He's in Florida this weekend, but he did talk to reporters on the plane ride down there. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Mr. President, when will the Navy start escorting tankers through the Straits of Hormuz?
That question there from our Jeff Mason, who covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg News. Jeff joins us now. And Jeff, I'm curious what more he offered beyond that about what we've seen is this real stillness in the Persian Gulf, a real reluctance on the part of these tankers to move through the Strait of Hormuz, despite the fact that the administration has floated reinsurance, has raised the specter of there being naval escorts that haven't materialized yet. When is that likely to change in the estimation of the president?
Good question. First of all, for your viewers and people who are watching on TV, I just want to explain why I'm in a van.
With that incredible hat, Jeff, I must add, an incredible chapeau.
Appreciate that. I left the hat on for Christina.
If you thought I wasn't going to comment on that hat, but we do want your opinion on what the president said, so I will keep my comments to myself. Yes.
Part of the uniform of a White House correspondent. But to your question, David, the president didn't give a whole lot more detail, and one of the questions I asked was when the Navy ships would start escorting tankers through the Straits of Hormuz, and he said soon. I think that's in part because he is sensitive to the fact that the oil markets are going crazy over this war. And the president has sought to send different signals. Yesterday, this defense secretary said in his press conference about the Strait of Hormuz, we've got it taken care of. You don't need to worry about it. Well, that's not how markets feel. But the administration is primarily focused on actually executing the war. But energy markets and how to deal with that strait is certainly at the top of their mind, even if they're not giving more clarity about when those ships are going to start that operation.
It's very sunny in Florida. I just want to point out there's a reason for the hat. It's in West Palm Beach and it is sunny.
I've had to sit next to other reporters in those pool vans doing live shots. I have never had to execute one myself. So well done, Jeff.
You can borrow the fedora when you do that.
Ben, I do have another energy question for you. We're talking about the strait and how it's blockaded and possible workarounds. And there aren't a ton, but Saudi does have a few pipelines that kind of go across the Red Sea. And right now, they are trying to bring a new one online a little bit faster. It's set to start, or the ramp up production fairly soon, 5 million of barrels per day. And there's a flotilla of tankers kind of en route from the Red Sea to Singapore. I'm wondering if that will help ease the pressure on Asia that seems to be feeling the squeeze from this particular shortage very acutely.
I think perhaps a little bit. All of these solutions are, by some measure, band-aids, right? I mean, there's no getting around the sort of massive disruption in the strait. But yes, I think one of the big questions there is, to what extent does this, while sort of resolving perhaps one risk in getting some more oil flowing into that through that east-west pipeline to avoid the Strait of Hormuz, the ships would still go near Yemen, right? And so, to what extent could there perhaps be some of the risks from the Houthi rebels there? I mean, I think getting to something that Jeff was saying a moment ago, I think a little bit of the sort of lack of clarity perhaps around what the U.S. Military goals here, or what the U.S. sort of military resolution of this could ultimately be, is because I don't think anybody really knows at what point the economic impact of this starts to have really tangible effects on the U.S. military posture and military strategy, right? I mean, there's so much in play. We just had some downward revisions to U.S. economic growth in the fourth quarter of 2025. I think that's probably something that the White House is acutely aware of. This morning, we got gasoline prices now averaging approximately $3.68 per gallon and still headed upward. And so, yeah, I mean, I think one reason why oil markets have not only been obviously had huge upward pressure and prices have soared, but there's also just so much astonishing volatility because the sort of, outlook for how this could possibly end remains so uncertain. And yes, to get back to your question, sending some more shipments through that east-west pipeline could perhaps alleviate, by a little bit of time, these big releases planned from strategic reserves by a little bit of time. You've got a few other minor levers that can be pulled. But again, these are all sort of very small scale solutions to what's a large and absolutely unprecedented problem.